Welcome back, everyone. We continue our seminar with the second lecture. It's my privilege to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Dan Stiver. He is a president and professor of the Fletcher Seminary in the US. He was a Cook-Derrick professor of theology at the Logsdon School of Theology of Hardin-Simmons University. And he also was the professor of Christian philosophy at the Southern Baptist Seminary. He was the president of the Society for Ricoeur Studies, and his impressive list of publications includes many books and articles on the philosophical thought of this French philosopher and his influence on theology. So it's quite difficult to name all the publications, books, and articles. So I will share with you later his CV, where you will be able to find something that will interest you. But for now, the title of his presentation is The Horrors and Hopes of History, Paul Ricoeur on Memory and History. Dr. Stiver, the microphone is yours, and in a moment, I will start to share the presentation.
Thank you very much. I do want to express thanks to Ksenia for helping get all this prepared and going. And we're going to work together to do the PowerPoint, which I hope is helpful to you. I thank all of you and for being able to do this and for the opportunity of sharing something that I'm pretty passionate about. Also, I want to resonate with what Matthew said at the beginning about my own lament, even grief over what is happening in Ukraine. I often go back to a great memory in 2009 of teaching a class at the Baptist Seminary in Odessa. And for the people that I got to know there and friends, and it's just been unimaginable to me to try to grasp what is happening and express my own regret too, that even though I think my understanding is most of the American people, thinking of the US, they support a great deal of support for Ukraine, but not enough to change the last election, which was one of the closest in modern history for America. So I just want to express that, where the title is The Horrors and Hopes of History. You're very aware of the horrors of history, and I hope in the midst of that, there is this place for hope. I want to draw on the thought of Paul Ricoeur, especially as a resource and as a framework, not necessarily the framework, but as a framework for dealing with the issues of memory and history. And also I'll be bringing in the issue of ideology. I am appreciative. I wanted to say thanks to Matthew for his good presentation, because it really helps. I'm going to be speaking, maybe you could say, at a more philosophical level, general level. And as a good historian, he gave us a lot of the concrete details on the ground that will actually help as background for a lot of what I'm saying. So I really appreciate that. Ricoeur's, you can go on to the next slide. His last major work, the Memory, History, Forgetting that you saw, it was his last major work, and it was exactly on these issues of memory and history, what to remember, what to forget. And it was a very long work too, when he was almost in his 90s. It reflects the way that he had dealt with, especially the issue of history or historiography through his life from the beginning all the way through. He began as a phenomenologist. That was his first major reputation. And so almost all of his work begins with description of experience. And that's what he does in this book on memory. But we'll be drawing on all of his work. Just to say a little bit more about him, if you're not that familiar with him, he is a hermeneutical philosopher. I see him and Hans-Georg Gadamer as the two sort of foundations of hermeneutical philosophy. And of course, there are many before them, but those are the two major figures, Gadamer on the German side, Ricoeur on the French. And since Ricoeur spent a semester every year for years at the University of Chicago Divinity School, he has a strong sense of the American context as well. When I first started studying Ricoeur, a lot of the emphasis, or his own, was, what's important are my ideas, and that's certainly true. And he didn't want to talk about his life, and others didn't either, but I found it pretty fascinating and helpful just to realize, for someone who spent his whole life talking about personal identity and identity, that he had quite the life of the 20th century. He never knew his father or mother. His mother died soon after childbirth. His father was missing in action in World War I, and they did not find his body until 20 years later. So he grew up with his grandparents, a very devout Protestant family, and with his older sister being his virtually mother figure in a lot of ways. And then she died fairly soon. Then World War II began. He had already had a lot of education, working especially with Gabriel Marcel. And he was a pacifist, but he felt led to join the war effort, and was captured right off the bat. And so he spent almost 5 years, if you can imagine, in an internment camp as a prisoner of war. It was not a concentration camp, but a pretty spare, difficult prisoner of war for a long time. And then after the war, he began his career, became one of the most popular professors at the Sorbonne, eventually in Paris. While there, he was jailed at one point for his protest against the French war against Algeria. He later, ironically, became a part of a new experimental university to give more rights to students and do it better than they were doing at the Sorbonne, and became dean, and then got caught up in the 1968 student revolts. And at one time was actually attacked by a student on horseback with a spear in the building. That was a very traumatic experience. And maybe it was, I'm not sure he was cut out for administration like a lot of scholars. So he turned away from that. And that's where, after that, he began coming to the United States half the year for a long time, and had such an influence here, especially through the University of Chicago. Should mention, one of his sons committed suicide. That was a grievous thing for him to the time of his death. And he dedicated his Gifford lectures to that son. So he's someone who's experienced personally and in a larger level, very engaged with the history of the 20th century and the issue of totalitarian societies, very close at hand. I should mention he was studying in Germany when Hitler came to power, and World War II was about to break out, and had to essentially flee Germany at that time. So to go on down to Ricoeur again, as a hermeneutical philosopher, the major point is that it's interpretation all the way down. So everything is interpreted, and certainly that's true for history, historiography, that it's always an interpretation. And in one of his major enterprises, a 3-volume work on narrative, time and narrative in the 80s, the volume 1 was spent dealing with the debate, historiographical debate, between the older idea of history as totally objective, just dealing with the facts and not interpreted very much, and the other side of the spectrum, that history is so much interpreted that it's virtually fiction. And so there really can hardly be a history, it's all ideological. And as he often did, he was a very dialectical thinker. And so he would take different positions and find a kind of, maybe not Hegelian synthesis, but a kind of synthesis between those, of saying that history and fiction are both configured. They're both figurative. They're both interpretations, but they're not the same. And so he would always maintain there is a place for a certain kind of, you might say, postmodern subjectivity or objectivity in history. That historiographers owe a debt to the past, and they have to deal with documents and traces and testimony and memory. And that eventually led him to that later book, Memory, History, Forgetting. So history is viewed then, as you see there, as history is always hermeneutical, that is always interpreted, and that's its power and its danger. History is almost always, despite everything, it's used, and then it's also abused. To chime in with Matthew, as we speak, there's the debates, it's historical debates in this country about the racist past and the racist present. Even in Texas, where I am, in Fort Worth, Texas, making it illegal for teachers in the public schools to say negative things about the past and race. Even in a school district right next to where I live, there was controversy that became national about teachers wondering, and were told that maybe they had to give equal time to both sides of the Holocaust issue. You obviously are living through a debate of histories, the invasion of Ukraine, and as you know better than I, it's described in different ways by others, and unfortunately some major leaders in this country. It's a debate of histories between Jews and Palestinians now. What is the history? So there's a place for a certain objectivity in history, and we'll talk about it later, the truthfulness of history, and that's valid, but there's always the issue of ideology, taken in, as it often is, ideology has negative connotations of a distortion of history. I mentioned here that Ricoeur, as I mentioned, did 3 volumes on the issue of narrative, where he began his emphasis on personal identity as narrative identity. In a lot of times when people talk about narrative as a narrative theology, it's positive. We need stories. I think that's true. We all need stories, and they're a part of our identity. But when you're talking about ideology, it's often taken as in a negative way, because ideology is almost always stories as well, and almost always involves history. So there are the two sides of it. And as he said there, in fact, before the abuse, there was the use, the unavoidably selective nature of narrative. If one cannot recall everything, neither can one recount everything. So history is always selective. So that's a kind of fundamental philosophical position. The next point I want to turn to is another side of his work that was done in the 70s at the University of Chicago Divinity School, his lectures on ideology and utopia. I've always found that to be such a significant work, and a lot in the Christian or theological circles don't pay as much attention to it. And one of the interesting things and sort of difficult things about Ricoeur is that he would tend to go from one issue to another, whether it was evil or symbolism or metaphor or narrative, history, even Freud, and just deal with it on its own terms and not necessarily integrate it with all the other things he was doing. So it makes it very difficult often for people to, excuse me, to come to Ricoeur. They often ask me, well, what book should I read? And it's like, well, there are about 8 to get a hold of it. So, and he himself even one time said it's kind of hard for him to see how it all fits together. So one of the big tasks is to pull a lot of things together. And this is a work that he did that's so significant on the issue of ideology, the whole Marxist tradition and others. At the same time, he was doing all this work on hermeneutics and on metaphor, and you would never know it because he never mentions the others, in this work. But the issue of ideology is important because it's part of, as I mentioned, ideology is almost historical, always historical. And one of the contributions I think that he made that's very significant in contrast to the Marxist tradition is that he started with the idea that there is a positive side to ideology. Ideology is often taken in a negative sense. But as he pointed out, virtually any movement, any nation, any church, any denomination has a founding story, a story, and ideology in that sense. And he outlined a kind of threefold aspect that ideology constitutes an entity. It then moves to legitimate or conserve a movement. And then, of course, he did say there is genuinely a distortive, manipulative, negative use of ideology. And he talked about an almost gravitational pull of ideologies towards this negative side because they almost always have to simplify complex realities. And what often happens then is ideologies become petrified, they become hardened, and don't allow for flexibility, for critique. And then at worst, they become instruments of vested interest. It becomes a way for people in power to hold on to their power. They may use actually admirable themes of the ideology to keep themselves in power. And Matthew gave a lot of examples of that in the United States. The idea that America should be great. Okay, that's admirable. Any nation should probably strive to be great. But then it becomes dissimulating, it becomes distortive when it's used to suppress criticism, suppress dissent, and is unwilling to change, and often gives even a false history, a false picture of the way things were. Like in my circles growing up and so on, there's often a kind of a nostalgic look back at the 50s. And for some people, it was pretty good after the war and when America was expanding. But for a lot of people, that was a time of Jim Crow and segregation. and it was not a good time at all. Women had few rights at that time. So there's all three sides of it, and that's important to see that there is a positive place to have an inspiring story. I would imagine that's very true in your Ukrainian context, but it's always it often ends up being a case of contested histories and contested uses of the ideology. So to focus on the negative aspect of ideology, as I was mentioning, Ricoeur, to go to the next slide, Ricoeur says ideology occurs in the gap between a system of authorities' claim to legitimacy and our response in terms of belief. That often it claims maybe more than it can deliver. Like in our country, it's interesting, the appeal to Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. Well, we know he didn't really mean that. It wasn't even all men that were equal. He certainly didn't include women. But yet, that's what he said. And it's come to have a kind of power beyond that. And so famously, Martin Luther King Jr., not only drawing on his Christian beliefs, but also he drew on that as an ideal. So to undergird the civil rights movement, appeal to people beyond Christians, to all American citizens, and it has a lot of purchase in that way. So the question to Matthew about the ideal and the real comes in here, and the challenge is holding them both together. That there is a place for the ideal, but the ideal can fall into ideology in this negative sense very easily, and can be manipulated and misused. So to make it worse, go to the next slide. I've done a lot of work in philosophy, and especially on the issue of ideology. And one of the things that I realized is ideology is bad enough when you're thinking about it as a kind of conceptual system or something that's explicit. But the problem is ideology is embodied. It's in our bones, so to speak. And bias is so many studies now of bias and confirmation bias and other kinds of bias that is unconscious, that we indwell as we grow up and from the society around us without necessarily even it being explicitly addressed. It has to do with the presuppositions that, as people say, that are what we think with, not what we think about often. It's often very difficult to do ideology critique of ourselves. It's very difficult often to become aware of presuppositions. And the thing is, they're embodied, that is, they're felt as much as telt, we might say. They're felt as much as told. That they, we have an emotional investment in them that is somewhat unconscious a lot of the times. And it's hard to come to grips with this, that pull us in a certain direction, even if explicitly we would say no. There are a lot of instruments one can use now to test one's racism. And often one would say, I'm not racist. I don't want to be a racist. I'm very much post-racism. But you take this test about sort of unconscious ways that you respond. And even you can take tests with people monitoring your physical responses. And you find out, yeah, you're reacting in a racist way. So one of the challenges then of dealing with the whole issue of ideology is that it's actually already hard, and it's even harder than we think. And I think we can see the pernicious effects of it in the way like a Donald Trump can manipulate people. He's not very good at a lot of things. He is good at manipulating people by appealing to their worst fears and emotions. He's really good at that. And it shows us just how powerful these things are. So, what to do? What to do? It's a problem, and it's difficult, and it's not easy to overcome. A suggestion from the resources of Ricoeur's thought, as I mentioned, at the same time he was doing these lectures on ideology and utopia in the 70s, the University of Chicago, he was developing his notion of a hermeneutical arc that came out of his, again, trying to deal with both sides of a continental debate between the hard sciences and the social sciences or humanities, where as many of you probably know well, the humanities appeal to understanding, that is a more intuitive, holistic kind of appreciation that's important in historiography. And then the hard sciences, which deal with explanation, was the word that was used, that's more objective, more external, more analytical, and so on. And often there was this great divide between the two. And Ricoeur tried to show how hermeneutics involves both. And so one of his contributions beyond Gadamer was what people see as critical hermeneutics. Gadamer's famous work is Truth and Method. And as Ricoeur pointed out, it might have better been said it was truth or method, that it came across a lot of times as being against method. And Ricoeur was wanting to say, yes, there's a place for method. There's a place for science. There's a place for data, for facts. And yet it's inscribed within the overall sphere of understanding. So the hermeneutical arc is that the first understanding is often described as a first naivete. And as he said, we always start too late. Unlike the sort of modern assumption, you could say Cartesian assumption, that one can be totally objective and put aside all of one's biases and just start from scratch. Ricoeur, as many others, would say you can't do that. And we always start with presuppositions. By the time we can be very critical, we're already formed in very deep, embodied, unconscious ways, as I mentioned. So on anything, let's say a new book or a movie or an event, we always start with that first reaction, that first evaluation that is understanding. It's more holistic, involves our whole body. But then he said there is a need for a second moment, critique. He's very famous for having a hermeneutics of suspicion. And as he acknowledges, not everybody does that. It's uncomfortable. But that's a place that we have to push to, and he thinks that's very characteristic of modernity. Where I think he made a really good contribution then is saying that there needs to be a third moment on the hermeneutical arc, or he called it a spiral as well, which I think makes more sense because you keep going back again and again to issues. And he said that you need a second understanding, or it's described as a post-critical naivete, or a second naivete. That is, as Marcus Borg put it in a book one time, the theologian or biblical scholar, reading the Bible again as if for the first time. And it's understanding in that, again, this appropriation or your final judgment is more holistic. It can be made for a variety of reasons. And the reason this is important, I've seen this in seminary students a lot, is sometimes one can get overwhelmed with the criticism. Maybe like Matthew's second group, that it's all criticism. It's just criticism. And maybe unfairly or not, some of the French postmodern movement is somewhat known for this. It's all criticism of Derrida and Foucault and so on. So where's the constructive alternative? What can we do? We can tear apart everything, but can we build up anything constructive? So he was saying that you need to push, and you could talk a long time about this because it doesn't necessarily happen automatically. And it sometimes takes great effort. I would even say it can be a spiritual discipline that one has to move to a judgment. So in dealing with ideology, it's that process of going through the critical aspect, and that can involve all the methods that we might that we can draw on. Now, to the next slide, Ricoeur himself, in the book on lectures on ideology and utopia, thought that utopia is that privileged place where you can bring critique. It's the view from nowhere. It's the view from outside. You need to be able to stand outside the ideology to be able to see its strengths and weaknesses. And I think there's great truth in that. In fact, one of the great things about wider dialogue between places that can seem far away, whether Ukraine and the United States or other places, is hearing from other perspectives from people outside your own context. Ricoeur was also very aware in the Marxist tradition, utopia is usually a negative thing because it's illusory, it's fanciful, it's like dreaming. But he wanted to say it has kind of a threefold function that parallels the threefold function of ideology. It provides an alternative, it subverts ideologies, but it itself can be an illusion. It can be unrealistic. And history is full of utopian projects that fail because of being unrealistic. So in that book, he said we have to call upon the healthy function of ideology to cure the madness of utopia. And the critique of ideologies can only be carried about by, in a sense, utopia. Now, the thing I would like to say is, Ricoeur hinted at this, but he didn't develop it, is that a lot of times critique comes from within, not just from without. At times even implied that the initial ideology is almost always a utopia, involves the utopian imagination. And then it, like any social movement, you start, let's say, with a charismatic figure, charismatic figures, a lot of vitality, a lot of energy, a lot of creativity. And then inevitably, if it's going to survive, it needs to become institutionalized to some extent. And that can be a good thing, but it often then leads to all of the problems where it's the institution for institution's sake, or it protects those who have privileged positions in the institution and sacrifices the individual. So I love the way he described that. He said ideology helps to prolong the initial effervescence of the initial movement, that initial energy. And what I like to think is that the role of critique is often recovering the initial effervescence. That is one way of critique of ideology, is to go back to the original vision. And that's very clear in Christianity. I think virtually every new Christian movement goes back to the Bible, or it goes back to Jesus. And I think that can be very powerful. So in a lot of ways, it's often going back to the history and interpreting then what history and what should we emphasize. So it involves, when you get to history, it's critical history. I mentioned that Ricoeur dealt at length with the debates in historiography and argued that even though it's interpreted, it's configured, there's still a place for data, for facts, for documents, for memories. And so the challenge is to meet poor, distorted history with truthful history. And that's what we're doing. That's what we're living with. Just in the last few days, we had Trump giving a history about tariffs in the United States and income tax. That's just false. But of course, the people that follow him tend to just go along with it. So it has to be contested. And there are a lot of people trying to do that. It's a valiant effort and it has to be done. But it is kind of a battle. Okay, then you might ask, well, how do you know what's true? And there's a long answer to that. And that's the role, again, I would call on for Ricoeur. And I know we're getting toward the end here. A lot can be said about it, but he, as many others, have drawn on this kind of recovery of Aristotle's notion of practical wisdom or phronesis in a way much broader than Aristotle, because Aristotle actually thought theoretical reason was better than theoretical wisdom was better than practical wisdom. It's kind of a turning of Aristotle on his head, and basically saying that practical judgment is at the root of everything, even the sciences, as philosophy of science now indicates. And the thing about Aristotle, his view of practical wisdom, that's helpful is that he said there's a role for ethical maxims, guidelines, generalities, but in complex cases, there's no excuse for judgment, and you can't make up enough rules. There's not a formula, there's not a calculus that can determine the wise thing to do in every situation. You have to make a judgment. And that involves training and a lot of things, but in the Christian context, it involves being properly formed. It involves drawing upon Jesus. It involves drawing upon Christ. But in making decisions about historiography, it's paying attention to the truth and combating distorted views as best one can with more truthful views. Ricoeur had a collection of interviews that was published in this book called Critique and Conviction. And I think that captures the great challenge, because often we can have convictions without critique. So we're naive, and we can be deceived and misguided. We can have so much critique that we can never come to a conviction. We can fall into what Ricoeur one time called the desert of criticism. We need to hold those together. And I've been fascinated in recent years by this passage. If I can be as a Baptist, appeal to a biblical verse. 1 Thessalonians 5:19, it's in that same context of the powerful injunctions to rejoice always, pray without ceasing, and everything give thanks. Right there, he also says to test everything. Test everything. That's amazing. Apparently, already by the 50s for Paul, people were coming in claiming to be inspired by God and saying things that Paul didn't think were right. And so he was saying, be willing to test everything. But he also said, don't quench the spirit. Now that's hard to do. Don't then reject all claims to be inspired or even your own inspiration, but be willing to test everything. So I think that is, in terms of finally making these difficult judgments about what is the true history, that it takes practical wisdom. I would add a social dimension of it. It takes each other. It takes dialogue with many others being tested by each other. And then finally, interestingly, in the epilogue of Memory, History, Forgetting, he entitled it Difficult Forgiveness. He called it an odyssey of forgiveness. And of course, in that book, he was dealing not only with European history, but the South African Reconciliation Commission issues of amnesty and pardon on a national level, things like that. And I think, as Matthew said, in the middle of a war, it's not easy to talk about forgiveness. It may not be the time for it. But it may be better, hopefully, in a hopeful outcome in some way. Those issues have to be dealt with. And as he would point out, forgiveness doesn't necessarily mean an absolute forgetting. It includes practical steps of justice, hope, and reconciliation. It includes, he has a whole section on manipulated memory. And it involves reparation, practical restoration, repentance in the biblical sense. Maybe this is a more personal word as someone who was just about 90 years old. He ended the book on these words: carefree memory on the horizon of concerned memory, the soul common to memory that forgets and does not forget. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dan Stiver, for this presentation, and thank you for raising the question, the hermeneutical question, and the hermeneutical issues how they relate to the memory. And thank you also for sharing with us your presentation with us, like the previous presentation. They were really very insightful. I read all of them, and thank you for that too. So if you don't receive those, the link or the presentation, just send me a message and I will share with you them again. So I think that maybe Heidegger or maybe someone else from the continental philosophy said that the being in the world, like like we are like the interpreting beings in the world rather than just the beings in the world, because everything that we receive through our relationship to the world is like always the interpretation. So I think that yeah, and then we speak about Paul Ricoeur. For me, it's always also has a kind of meaning, because when I was a student, I was also interested in this desert of criticism, and then the second naivete, and but then I was tempted by the deconstruction and the Derrida, so that's my path. But the question will, from like, I think the first question that I will have, and I also invite everyone to ask your question, to submit them in the chat. I see that we have already some of them. But the first question to start our discussion, why Paul Ricoeur? So why this is so meaningful person for you, because you dedicated many years to study his thoughts and to study his personality. So why Paul Ricoeur?
Okay, good question. I should mention just a little kind of funny note or interesting on Derrida, who, and it depends on how you interpret him. You know, I think he's caricatured a lot of times, but he was a student of Paul Ricoeur, actually lived with Paul Ricoeur for a while. And Paul Ricoeur helped him through his doctorate. And they had a unfortunate misunderstanding, which I often thought two of the greatest interpreters in the 20th century didn't understand one another. So it lasted a few decades, and then they were reconciled towards the end of both of their lives. They ended up like talking, I think, almost every day or weekly, became really close toward the end of their lives. So that's an interesting thing. In the sense that Derrida, even though he's identified with deconstruction, he's a hermeneutical figure. You know, it's interpretation for him, of course, all the way. It's interesting. I didn't really get that into Ricoeur till after I was teaching. I did do a semester at the Divinity School, the University of Chicago, in 1981. And I was focusing on theology more at the time. And I went to one lecture by Ricoeur, and I wish I'd done more. But that was just for fun. And it was like a room packed out, students sitting on the floor. And his lecture was very detailed. And I realized if I'm going to get anything out of this, I would have to spend a lot of time studying. And I had other seminars I had to do. Interestingly, for some of you, maybe Langdon Gilkey and Hans Küng at the time. So it was afterwards that I really became interested, because I began teaching more in the philosophy area at Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. And just trying to figure Ricoeur out is how I ended up writing the book, Theology After Ricoeur. And it apparently struck quite a chord, because a lot of other people were trying to figure him out too, you know, and like pull a lot of these things together. And so then after that book, I was thinking, okay, I'm kind of done with Ricoeur. I'm going on to other things. And he died, and the next year there was a special conference on his thought in Oklahoma City. And I went, a lot of other people went, and there was such energy that some got together and thought, let's start a society. And I ended up being caught up in that ever since. And that society has flourished. Uh, so this continuing society, I should mention there's a journal on his thought. There's a series on his thought that has over 30 books. In some ways, he was very famous during his lifetime, but as much or more interest now than then. And these meetings are often very lively because so many societies are focused on a particular area, particular issue. And with Ricoeur's interests were so wide that you get people from all kinds of different disciplines from all over the world in dialogue, and that can be very creative. So it's kind of institutional in a way that drew me in and kept me in, but also I just find, without agreeing with everything he said, I just find I just so often am comfortable with where he ends up or the direction he's pointing.
Thank you. Yeah, you mentioned about it depends how we interpret like Derrida and Ricoeur, their thoughts. But from your presentation, like I just do see that there are really many similarities about when we think about their approaches to the interpretation. And yeah, so maybe then the question will be, I do receive the question from one of our participants, and I want to mention it a little bit later. But the question may be on the how we define maybe memory. So from your presentation, I do understand that the memory and the history, it's like the two different forms of the interpretation. Or in some way, we can speak about the memory, kind of the subversive element for the different forms of the interpretation, like the construction of the reality. Is it so? Like how the Ricoeur thinks about memory. So what is?
Well, Ricoeur himself, especially in this book, there was a kind of phenomenology. He was very aware of all the issues of, in a way, false memory, manipulated memory, and it raised that question of what to remember, what to forget. I thought it was interesting for someone's last major work of a very long life to end with the title, The Word Forgetting, which sometimes happens to older people. But memory, history, forgetting. And often the issue is what happens is we remember the wrong things and we forget the wrong things. Now, I would support what he's saying by now, and some of you may know more, but like brain studies, studies of memory, that is scientific, psychological kind of studies of memory, show that memory is always constructed. It's not like in our minds, there's this written document and we just go back to it and repeat that every time we remember something, it's another construction. And so that helps account, even the initial memory is already an interpretation of an event. You know, what happened? If any of you have ever been in like car wrecks or court cases, you can be very aware of that. You have different witnesses to the same event, and they can describe it in different ways, or they pick out different things to focus on and identify. So thing I didn't mention, another part of Ricoeur's thought that's very interesting is he had an essay called A Hermeneutics of Testimony. And he talked about it's kind of like in a courtroom situation, there's always a trial, a contesting of the testimony. You take someone's testimony, but then you can contest it. And that's important. And then later, he kind of transmuted that notion into his idea of attestation, where we come to this judgment about things that becomes a kind of, he says, anyway, it's personal. It's a risk. In the end, when we make large judgments about philosophy, about faith, about religion, about history, it's a risk, and we have to back it with our whole lives. And he says no one can escape this. We sometimes have to contest our own memories, which is a good thing to do. And sometimes it's surprising. We find out other people remember something a little differently, and maybe we've misremembered.
Yes, thank you for this clarification. The question is that we have from our participants is about the disillusion from the meta-narratives after the Second World War. So the question is why after the general disillusionment, with the meta-narratives after the World War II, there is a temptation to return to total ideology. Like about this never again. So that was like the philosophy of this second part of the 20th century. So does it really work, you think, when we in this context that we have now?
Well, that's a big question in general, and then to relate now. Yeah, and Ricoeur participated in that. The Lyotard's question about meta narratives and appeal to little narratives, and I think that's valuable because I think we can't avoid narratives. I think that's just phenomenologically, that's part of the human condition, a part of what it means to be human. Ricoeur one time called himself a post-Hegelian Kantian. And what he meant by that is he appreciated a lot of the concreteness of Hegel over against Kant, that he wanted Kant's critique, especially of Hegel's grandiose meta-narrative of the end of history, that you could figure it all out and come up with kind of this one view. So there's the place for the criticism, for sure. And the awareness, I think, especially from the French side, Derrida and others, of meta-narratives, is they saw how it was used ideologically. If I claim to have the meta-narrative, and maybe it doesn't include others, then it becomes oppressive. And we saw that in Europe. And it happens now all the time. Now, some say, well, they reject actually the Christian faith. And isn't that a meta narrative? Isn't that a very large narrative? And certainly it is. But I've been influenced. Merrill Westphal, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He wrote about this, and he said there's still a place for mega narratives, not meta narratives, in the sense that a meta narrative claims too much. It doesn't have humility. It's too detailed. It's too universal. But a mega narrative can be a large story with a lot of flexibility that he would identify as the Christian story. Or you could relate it to another religious faith as well, or a philosophical faith, but it needs to be, in a way, humble and open to criticism. And I'm also attracted to the Apostle Paul's statement, we know in part, that we always are aware that we only have partial knowledge.
Thank you. We have I see that we have more questions, so or maybe we will try to answer those two questions. So the first question is about criteria that we use for the interpretation. So in a time when everything is an interpretation, what criteria we use to choose the better one, or because I just do remember that in one of your presentations you mentioned about the Civil War in the US, and you said that the fact why people chosen another interpretation not was just because the interpretation was better or worse, but because of the war and the context of the war. So for Ricoeur, does he use the kind of the criteria for the interpretation? What should we trust?
Well, it's at a general philosophical level, as you might imagine. But it's valuable in that he pointed to there is the place for like in historiography, that's a little clearer, that you can refute false histories with evidence. There's a place for, let's say, methodology and approaches. So, like a lot of the claims about like this, when I was growing up, people in the South would often say the Civil War was just about states' rights. It was not really about slavery. That was just a minor thing. Well, you can go back to the documents. You can go back to what the leaders said in Texas, for example. You can see the rationale for why they seceded from the Union. And they said it's because of slavery. Now, states' rights were a part of it. It's not one-sided, but slavery was pretty clearly the main issue. So there's a place to appeal to evidence. There's still a place for arguments. And you know, in the 70s, Ricoeur drew on structuralism, for example, at that time, as a helpful method in interpretation. So there's a place in biblical studies. I've mentioned, you know, it's all the biblical studies: form criticism, source criticism, even post-colonial criticism. There's feminist, womanist. Like there's a place for all of the kinds of approaches to play. So it's the problem. What I often find is when people are sort of confronted with this shift to say it's all interpretation and you don't have Cartesian certainty, that then it's like, well, then anything goes. It's all relative. My opinion is as good as yours. And you know, we had the spectacle of the spokesperson for the President Trump in his previous administration saying, well, there are alternative facts. And what she was referring to were not backed up by evidence. So that's the place then in the end of the issue of practical wisdom. In a theological context, we could say discernment. There's a place for spiritual discernment or just discernment in general. There's a place for wisdom to look at the evidence, look at the arguments, hear the testimonies, and then try to make considered judgments, realizing that you know in part still, and that you might be fallible. The title of one of Ricoeur's early books was Fallible Man, that we always have a dimension of fallibility.
So the last question, because we will have just several minutes. So the question is, which memory leads to what sort of, or to whose agency? Memory and agency.
Yeah. I'm not sure I understand everything behind the question. I mean, the memories almost always lead to agency. It is they influence action often. And as we've been talking, the memories get translated into the histories and narratives that become an ideology that justify, legitimate what we do. So that it's always happening. But again, the question comes back to, are the memories reliable? Are they accurate? Are they truthful? If not the whole truth, are they truthful? And I think inevitably then they become a basis for action and for agency. That's the value of hearing the minority voices in history, because their memories were not recorded, their memories were not heard. And when you hear those memories, when you hear those testimonies and you evaluate them as valid, it leads to revolution sometimes. It leads to major change, like in the Black Lives Matter, the whole debate about what happened with George Floyd that was mentioned. It probably would have been suppressed. No one would ever have really known about it if somebody had not, interestingly, taken a video.
Yeah, that's true. I think that the Elie Wiesel, I think after the Holocaust, he wrote a lot on this topic on memory. And he also mentioned that if we do not remember the voices of victims, it's too easy for us to lose our human face. So we always need the presence of their voices. So thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you for revealing this aspect on memory, like philosophical and theological. And thank you for sharing your like other presentation. And I encourage everyone to read. I've shared the link with you again. So just we will have, I think that you shared with us 4 or 3 presentations on this topic from the very different perspective from the embodied, like unembodied hermeneutics, something that you shared with us today. So thank you very much for that. Encourage everyone to read and invite you for the second lecture that we will have with the Ukrainian expert on memory, Anton Drobovich. I think he was one of the prominent experts on the memory. We don't have a lot, but I'm very happy that he accepted our invitation, and he will visit, he will share with us on Ukrainian perspective. We don't hear like a lot on Ukrainian perspective, but today I hope that we'll have this chance to speak on Ukraine, on a war, how we try to memorize something, what is going on today. So I invite everyone. In 15 minutes, we will continue our seminar. So thank you again, Dr. Dan Stiver, for being with us today and sharing your thoughts and your reflections and your study. Thank you.
You're welcome.